Hey there friends, Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. I've had so much fun today. I have been crafting all day long. I've been making these really fun cards using some stamps from our sponsor, topflightstamps.com. Now they go all over the world and find the coolest stamps and bring them back to us here in the United States. The stamps I use today are from Lavinia Stamps out of the UK, and their fairies are so fun and whimsical. I made 8 cards. I made 4 gift tags. I just had so much fun with these, and the best part is you're going to make, and I'm going to show you how, we're going to make some pattern paper with our jelly plate and some inks and some mixed media techniques, and then we'll cut them up and not waste a scrap and make all this good stuff from them. So without further ado, let's go to the tutorial and I'll show you how you can make it yourself. I really wanted to have a cool artsy vibe with these cards and tags and bookmarks, so I thought I would use my jelly plate, and this is a Jelly Arts jelly plate. The gel press ones are good too. It doesn't really matter, whatever you have. And if you want to do similar techniques and you don't own a gelatin plate, you can just smush ink out on a craft sheet. Now, the nice thing about using inks on your jelly plate is that you don't have to go through the big ordeal of getting out paint and then cleaning up paint and all that. You could just press the ink pads to your palette. Distress oxides are a pigment dye hybrid, so they're a little thicker, so they're less likely to bead up on the plate. But if all you have is dye-based inks, that will work too. Experiment with what you have. And like I said before, you can always just, rub your ink pads to paper. You could use blending sponges, or you could even find a pattern paper that's got a kind of an all-over color and texture, just nothing that has a really distinct pattern to it, and you could use that as well for your backgrounds. I've been feeling kind of in a rut with my card making lately, and one of the best ways for me to break out of it is to kind of use those artsy materials. Now this thing here, this white thing, it's like an unmounted rubber stamp. It's actually a Carabel Studios texture mat, and it's meant to be used with jelly plates because any sort of numbers or text or letters that are on there have been made so that when you stamp with them on the plate and then you pull your print, everything will be white right way around. But you can totally do that with a rubber stamp if you don't have one of those texture mats. But I have them, so I figured might as well use them. I'll link up to all those in the video description as well. Now I do like to use my brayer if I'm going to be adding a color, like say in the middle, or if I just want to move my colors around, because I don't want to like wipe my ink pad across and contaminate the colors. So the brayer makes it really easy to do that, and also to cover the full jelly plate if you feel like the ink's speeding up or just not covering very well. And again, just pressing in texture. You could also use like a crumpled up bag or mesh or anything that you have, embossing folders, things like that for texture too. And what I'm going to be doing here is actually, I'm just making 4 prints. So something like that that's all over and plain, I would go over that again with another pattern to build up some interest. Like that really plain one, I did that polka dot stencil over it. So I basically just keep printing until I'm happy with the results. I ended up with 4 pages, so that's plenty to make all kinds of cards and tags and bookmarks. I'm going to do my stamping today with black pigment ink, and then I'm going to coat it with clear embossing powder. That way I know I can do all sorts of inky techniques on top and not have to worry about anything. Now the big crazy stamp mount that you see is called a mega mount, and I like it when I'm stamping directly on my table because my table's not perfectly flat and I know I'll get a really good impression. I'm going over all of these pages that are completely dry. I actually ironed them. I'm going over them with my embossing pouch, which is just cornstarch in a little pouch I sewed, so that there's no extra moisture on my paper because I'm going to be heat embossing and I don't want stray powder. I am using clear just in case though, so if you're using a colored ink you can use clear and it will work just fine. I'm using an older mason jar stamp from my stash, but Darkroom Door does have a really cool one that I will link up to below, also from Top Flight Stamps. I'm coating my images with some clear detail embossing powder to lock down my ink, and then I'm tapping the excess on a folded piece of paper, and I find it so much easier to get it back in the container again if you put it on a folded paper. So there's a little tip for you. And I'm basically just filling up my pages. I'll look at a print and figure out where I think I want to use, like what portion of the paper I definitely want to use. And it does mean that I have some like waste paper there, but don't worry, because if you have any die cuts, or if you have any stencils that you can trace, you can use up those scraps of paper that you have left to make tags and banners and other things. So once you've done all your stamping and you've stamped your things as many times as you want to, then use your scissors to cut it out. Now, yeah, I probably could use my Scan and Cut to cut this out, but I thought it might be difficult with all the different patterns that I have there for the machine to recognize what was what. And it's really easy with something like this with a thick line to just cut right on the line and get a really nice edge. Now, if you don't feel like you're a good fussy cutter, what you can do is just take a black ink pad and ink around the edges of your stamped elements, and that will make it look like you cut perfectly on the lines. Surprisingly, I didn't feel like I needed to do that. My cutting was just fine. But these are really simple, smooth-edged objects. Now, I also cut out some teacups because I thought that would be really cool for an idea I had percolating, and I just cut out some tags and other things that I could use for my cards. So now what I'm using is these little blending tools that I made many years ago. I basically took black bottle caps, use any bottle cap, doesn't matter the color, and I took a cosmetic wedge sponge that you can get at the dollar store, folded it in half, and glued the ends into the bottle cap, and those make ideal sponges. I have a set for dye-based inks, which is I'm using here. Sponging in, I did walnut stain, I think, on the base, so it looked wood. And then I did some, I think it's like lemonade and pink. I don't know all the names. I just basically inked up to give it a veil of pretty color. Then I realized I have the Distress Oxides, which are nice and opaque, and they layer really well. So I'm actually going in with some of this, I think it's Broken China Distress Oxide ink, and it doesn't mud up with the colors underneath, surprisingly. And I'm just putting bits of regular Distress ink too. Now, my Distress Oxide ink blenders, what I did was I took old glass chess pieces and I did the same thing with the cosmetic sponges. And by having a different handle, I could tell what blenders are for my Distress Oxides and what are for my regular dye inks. And then after I got it all blended and it was dry, I just spritzed on some water and let that reactivate with the Distress ink and the Distress Oxides. They both react really coolly with water, and it just gives us another dimension of texture and interest in our background, because our stamping is going to be fairly simple, so I want the background to be really yummy. The inspiration for this project were these beautiful fairy stamps from Lavinia Stamps. Like I mentioned before, they're a company out of the UK, and they're just really nice quality, and the designs are just really elegant. Most of them are silhouette style stamps, so you kind of want to have a really jazzy background to use them with, so that you kind of really show them off in their best light. I decided I was also going to do some embossing with that, so it's really important if you're going to emboss on a background you made that you make sure your paper is super dry. You want to dry it and use the embossing buddy on it, and that's just going to take away any moisture that your embossing powder could stick to. Now, a product I really like, and you can, it's kind of come back into popularity, is called embossing tinsel. So after I stamped this with the pigment ink, I went in with my black embossing tinsel. It's also can be called embossing glitter. It might be called like embossing glitz or embossing ritz. I think there's many different brand names that make it. This one's from Embossing Arts Company, and it's very, very old. I'm not sure if they're still in business, but you can find something comparable. But I just think it's so pretty. Now, you'll notice a subtle shift. I don't know if it shows up on camera or not, but when you're using it, you're going to see as it sets, it becomes just a slightly bit more holographic. So you'll be able to tell whether it's set or not. Otherwise, there's not that much difference. It doesn't make a big change like when you're doing embossing powder and you can see it go from dull to shiny. So you really just have to pay attention, because you don't want to overheat the that embossing glitter, or it will melt, because there's like mylar in there, and it can even smoke. You can sometimes see it smoke on you. So you just want to, do it fairly quickly, really watch for the cues that it's changing, and then be done with it. Don't overheat it. I thought this mason jar with the tiny little fairies was really cute, and that idea comes from my friend Kathy, who told me she had the idea to make cards like that, and I thought that's a really cool idea. So total props to my friend Kathy for that idea. And I thought it'd also be a nice opportunity to use my metallic watercolors. Now, these are the Paul Rubens metallic watercolors, and a couple months ago I did a watercolor showdown where I compared all the different sets of metallic watercolors I had. These were the most expensive, but I have to say they were the best quality. If you have metallic watercolors already, use what you have, but if you are looking for a set, these are really nice. And they do come in a smaller set that's less expensive, so something to consider if you're needing that. And I flicked on some metallic watercolor too, just to give it a little bit of a mystical sparkliness. When you are making a large batch project like this, like I think I ended up with 8 cards and 4 bookmarks and 4 other tags, you want to repeat the techniques as much as possible, or repeat using the same materials as much as you can, because it's going to save you some time. And honestly, to make one card and to make a huge batch of cards, it doesn't take that much longer because you've already got all your supplies out and decisions made, and you know, your workspace dirtied up. So you might as well make a bunch, and then you have a bunch to either share, or you know, you'll have your stock of cards to send all made up. I thought these little toadstool fairy houses were super cute, and I thought it would be almost kind of like a little fairy house, like to put them together in a bell jar like that. I could see, like, I don't know, kids making fairy houses. I thought it was kind of a neat little motif, and having that limitation of that bell jar as that's where you're going to build your scene, that is, it really just takes a lot of the stress away and lets you create freely. So there's something to be said for having a little bit of constraint and restrictions when you're creating, because it can really make you push yourself to see how creative you can be in that tiny space. Another background technique I wanted to share with you is direct inking. So if you don't have a jelly plate and you want a similar look to what I did earlier, try this. All you have to do is rub your ink pads on your cardstock. And these are just some bookmarks I die cut out of inexpensive cardstock. And again, you want to choose colors that are near to each other on the color wheel. So I've started with that kind of teal color and went in with some kind of like a seafoam green color, and then I added a little bit of violet, and then just blended where the colors met. Now the nice thing about the Distress Oxide is that it's almost like a paint, and you can, it stays wet and you can kind of smear it around, and it's nice and opaque. So you know, you can use whatever you have for inks, but if you do have the Distress Oxides, this is a good opportunity to give them a try. And regular Distress inks, of course, too, they'll give you a very similar look. They're not going to be opaque like these are, but they're still going to look fantastic. This little stencil was actually something that I planned on using on the Artist Trading Coins video I did a couple weeks ago, but then I realized it's just a perfect size for cards and tags and small things like this, and I really just like that concentric circle dot theme, so I went over and I just sponged on it with that same Distress Oxide. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to spatter it with water and get that cool reaction. Now I like to use Distress inks and Distress Oxides together because they both react with water, and it just broadens, because I don't have a ton of Distress inks, I have quite a few Distress Oxides, but I don't have a full set of anything, so it just gives me a little bit more versatility. And now I am spattering in some metallic watercolors to kind of carry the theme across from the other projects, and I'm just making sure they're fully dry before I start my stamping. Now you will see on one of these cards, well, I don't know, maybe Jason edited it out, but if it's there, you're going to see where I messed up and the paper was still a little wet, but I call that a teachable moment. And it'll be fine. Now, oh, speaking of teachable moments, right here you can see I have an image that did not stamp very well, so I'm just going to take a marker and fill it in. And I just want to grab a marker that I know won't dry perfectly quickly, so I don't want an alcohol pen. I'm just using a water-based marker. And then if I go quickly on top of that with my embossing tinsel there, it'll be wet enough to grab that ink. And I wanted it to look like the fairy was kind of like leaping out of a teacup, like maybe she was taking a nap in a teacup. So I'm just gluing this teacup down. So I went with cool colors on the tags because I knew that I had scraps left over from the main focal point prints that I did, and I was going to, and I die cut those teacups out of that color. Does that make sense? Because since I knew I was using those warm colors to cut the teacups, I did the tags in a cool color so they would stand out. I hope that makes sense. I thought it'd be really funny to have this big teacup with all the little fairies. Now that fairy up top there was still some wet spatters on the tag, and I didn't realize it. And when I went to do my embossing tinsel, that's why that one's a big blob. There was a bunch of wet tag there. So no. Live and learn, I guess. Make sure it's dry before you try to emboss. That's the moral of this video. And these little dragonflies were also from Lavinia. The thing that I like is that I've had some of these stamps for quite a while, and some are brand new, and they all work really well together. I like that when companies come out with stuff that matches their old stuff so that it doesn't just make everything you already have redundant. I used some fresh die cut bookmarks to back these bookmarks in, so that way I wouldn't have to try to cut that little tab out of cardstock. And the dies that I used for those, they were actually, I cut those out at a scrapbook store. They were an AccuCut die, if you're looking for that particular die. It does not fit in my Big Shot, because I tried borrowing the die to cut some at home, but it doesn't fit, it's too big. And then to stamp the back, I just inked up a big old block stamp, plopped those tags down, and rubbed over the back with a piece of paper, and it just gave me a nice, neat impression there. I didn't want to get that side too wet. I didn't want it to warp or anything, so I just tried to get a little bit of color back there. Now I thought that the little tags that I had die cuts of, which I cut out of the scraps of course, would look good as like tea bag tags. So I'm just taking a metallic silver gel pen to draw those little strings in to connect the teacup to the tea bag. And I just had this old stamp in my stash that said tea. I went with a coffee and tea themed stamp set. And I thought that would be really cute just to stamp on the little tags in case people don't know what the heck is that tag doing there floating in the air. People would know what it is. You know, sometimes you got to spell it out, folks. It's just the way it is. And then I just did a little inking with my sponge applicators again, so I wouldn't have it too sloppy. And I carried on that motif with the stencil on the back side of the bookmarks as well. And then I have these large kind of grungy words that are also by Lavinia Stamps, and they go great of course with all the stamps because that's how they roll. I really like that, and I just stamped that on the tags where they would fit. And I wanted to put some kind of funky fibers in here. I actually reorganized all my yarn so that my novelty stuff would be easily accessible and I could use it for paper crafting. And I added that through the holes on these tags to make really charming bookmarks. I think it's really fun to use supplies from other crafts that you do because it brings your personality into your card making and tag making. So the little mason jars were, by this time I realized, oh my gosh, I'm going to be here all night making cards if I don't speed up the process a little bit. So I thought the mason jars would be better for gift tags. And so I decided to kind of simplify, just take some plain large shipping tags, stamp a different sentiment on each, and ink it with the same colors, and just try to simplify a little bit so I could use up everything that I'd stamped. Otherwise, I was going to be too tired to keep on crafting with this, or I'd get bored basically if I spent too long on it. So I just basically kept repeating those colors. I grabbed a star stencil, added that in the background because I didn't want to layer up on this because I was just kind of hitting the overwhelm point in my crafting process. I think after a while, if I'm working with something too long, I just kind of get a little overwhelmed. So keep it simple, Lindsay, and just stuck to the same fibers and the same colors, and got 4 really cute gift tags from that endeavor. Now for the greeting cards, I decided that I would stick to happy birthday and with gratitude because you always need birthday cards, you always need thank you cards, so I knew those would get used. And I just simply embossed some panels, some black panels with a kind of a brick motif, and I'm using gelatos and gel crayons to just kind of color them. I've just pretty much experimented by dry brushing some white acrylic paint, by using some of the gel crayons, and also you'll see in a few minutes of using one of the Distress Oxide ink pads because those are kind of opaque, and I thought, well duh, I can really get the look of brick if I use fire brick Distress Oxide inks. It will stand out on the black and then I'll have that nice you know, the nice dark mortar. And you know, then I put a little patina in there with some green metallic crayon and just dry brushed on some white for that kind of, like, you know how brick gets, it gets all kind of frosty and patinaed and whatnot. And I thought that neutral background was really nice for these really bright ball jars. And that's a thing, you know, when you've spent so much time making your background papers and stamping and coloring, it's almost like you don't want to do too much to the card, because if you do, then it's going to detract from all that lovely stamping that you did and arranging that you did. So I wanted the card to be, I wanted to feel like, yeah, you're getting a card, it's something, you know, substantial, but I didn't want to detract from my little bell jars, if that makes sense. I wanted them to stand out. In fact, I probably could have just used a black panel and not embossed it or done anything to it, but that just felt too plain, like I wasn't giving enough attention to the focal points that I spent time on. So it's kind of a balance. You got a, you know, balancing act. You figure out what's going to highlight your focal image best, and you go that way. And I love these little metallic bowls from Harbor Freight. They're great for like catching your dies and your die cuts when you're working. I have two over by my die cutting machine, one for holding my dies so I don't lose them, and the other one for holding all the die cuts I cut out so I don't lose those either. So they're a really worthwhile investment. They go on sale for like $4 all the time. So I highly recommend them. And I used thin foam tape for the bell jars, and I used skinny foam tape, the famous yellow foam tape squares, for the With Gratitude banners that I also cut out of the scraps, mind you. And for embellishments, I'm just using some little glitter enamel dots. I think they look kind of like bubbles or orbs, and I think that goes really well with the fairies because it's just kind of whimsical and pretty. If you want to find any of the supplies that I used today, you can check them out at topflightstamps.com. I will have a detailed list in the video description. Thank you so much for watching today. Until next time, happy crafting!